John D. Rockefeller Jr. at one point, he's writing a letter during the 19-teens, and he's including all these people like, AT&T executives and like JP Morgan executives. He's like saying to them basically like, we need to start thinking about how to educate the public about like what we're doing and how we're, helping the whole world basically, right? Because that's the idea of their whole developmental like ideology is that they're helping the whole world by doing all this stuff, by developing all the, the rail networks and the banks and so he starts getting an interest at that point and taking it upon himself to carry out a public relations campaign, basically,
right?
To educate people, and that's really where the social sciences in America are coming from. Not in Germany with like people like Max Weber, but like this is the American kind of impulse for the development of our version of it, which is maybe more properly called like communications study, which is like what Walter Lippmann and Harold Laswell, what they were involved with, right?
Which was kind of driven around this whole idea is that like you search for like a universal in communication. You can have like a universal set of metaphors that, everything can kind of be routed through, communication, information being like a later like iteration of that. But I think that's kind of a contrast with some of like European social sciences, that predated this, where it was more about how like different things fit together. But in the American context, it was basically like, how do you render it all into kind of a common tongue in a sort of way, it reducing it down instead of like finding how it all kind of interweaves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of impulse that is driving the American development of social sciences, because one of the things that Rockefeller John D. Rockefeller Jr. ends up basically financing is something called Middletown, a study in modern American culture, and that's like in 1929. And this is basically a landmark kind of episode in the development of American identity as like as a kind of a unified thing. Right. And so we are always having these conversations as Americans all the time about like, what is American and, what's the American dream and, where do we come from and where does the melting pot and all this different stuff. And really, it's a complete construction during the 1920s and 30s that is deeply hooked into the development of social science research and polling and, anthropology and these kinds of projects that John D. Rockefeller Jr. is funding.
Yeah, and this is like, this was kind of like a profound crisis that America faced during the World War I period, especially, where, America was kind of like it was formed out of many people undergoing various exoduses from other places. And there was like no real common core, like this is an American identity, this is an American culture, this is an American language. And so like when you kind of got to this stage, this stage of like internationalization and also this like world conflict, World War I, that, in the aftermath, there's going to be this world peace. There was a huge drive to kind of produce an American identity, like an American culture, an American language. So that really had to like be built from the ground up. They had to make this like kind of like crystalline subject out of, just kind of produce it. Like we talked before about how like the world market never really existed until they started talking about, is there a world market? And then they came up with ways to like measure and determine whether or not there was one. And in doing so, they made it. I think you could draw like an analogous, set of comparisons. Like this is how the American identity or the American subject was kind of produced, through the question, does it exist? And, what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, what they ended up wanting to do, during this time is, it's also deeply connected to advertising, obviously, because this is a part of the context of like where polling comes from. And, there's a guy, when we talk about like, here's the latest Gallup poll of blah, 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 it's like there's a guy named George Gallup, and that's why it's a Gallup poll, because he's one of the fathers of polling, right?
Yeah.
And this is exactly the kind of time period that he's working, and he has some different contemporaries. Like there's a guy, Archibald Crosley, and another very important guy, Elmo Roper, who nobody has never
heard of them.
Nobody talks about these people ever. But they're the ones who develop polling, public opinion polling. And really the thing that ultimately comes about from these polls is that they're constructing the opinions of the public through the polling, right? It's like by writing the questions.
That's a much more succinct way of putting what I was trying to say.
No, it's exactly the same thing. It's important to kind of consider it from a lot of different multiple formulations to kind of really get at what they're doing. Because what they had been before we had these public opinion polls is they had to, the only way that if you wanted to like measure the public sentiment about like what the president was doing or like who's in the lead in the election, you had to do a full scale survey of as many people as possible. And very, very large numbers of millions and millions of people was the preferred way to do it. There was a famous kind of like straw poll that they did all the time every year before this, right? It was actually held by, I think, Literary Digest was the magazine who had did it, or something like that. Is that there's a famous like straw poll, and so what these pollers like Gallup and Roper were able to do was totally reduce that polling sample size that they needed to actually measure this. So now, obviously, when every poll that they put out there, when you're following the elections today, that like Nate Silver talks about, those are like 1,000 people being polled rather than millions of people. And so the idea is like this sample of people represents the whole population. And so if you think about that, it's like, what does that mean to represent like all people? It's like they're creating a microcosm of the United States and what, the population is supposed to be. And this is exactly what I mentioned, this Middletown study that John D. Rockefeller Jr. funded. And what was that? It was, they basically created, the average American town. It was actually they used the city of Muncie, Indiana, as the basis for this study that they did. They wanted to kind of find like the absolute average, middle of the road, kind of like what an American town was like in around 1930. And so they're really creating these things by doing them in miniature, right? Just like we're talking about with the World's Fairs, in the last segment, it's exactly, as a microcosm that's being used, as a kind of fill-in for this mass thing that is really only exists as a concept.
Yeah. This is a little bit ahead in the history, but after World War II, like when the U.S. Information Agency gets set up, one of the first things they do is actually a traveling MoMA exhibit called Family of Man. Have you looked at that?
Oh, no, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, Family of Man. Yeah, the Rockefellers were involved in this, obviously, and because it came out of the MoMA. And it was like pictures of, like families, but it's from families from like all over the world. And it's kind of like integrated into this kind of exhibit that you can walk through and interact with in certain ways. And it's supposed to kind of like promote the idea of like the global family. And so the U.S. Information Agency like took it all over the world, and try to promote this idea, the post-war harmony, the family of man, the peace, it's very, very like, I think people involved with UNESCO were also part of this. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and that's just like we were talking about with the World's Fairs too, and these museums and how those kind of work. It's all about, they're ordering all this information and, basically containing it for observation by people, and like as it's being observed, like it's like you're creating it as you're studying it, and it's the same idea here with all of these different little projects. So that's exactly how the idea of like the average American is coming about at the same time. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, they just kind of like, as time goes on, try to deploy it on larger and larger scales. Because, I mean, that's exactly the same, like when you talk about like public diplomacy, which is what they're all involved in. Public diplomacy is just a political mobilization of like public opinion work in a way that induces like kind of a reciprocal but intended effect. You create a series of public opinions, and then you kind of like organize your diplomatic efforts around that. It's a much more kind of full spectrum and dynamic way of going about diplomacy.
Yeah, and so this is exactly at this same time that we're talking about this. This obviously has a impact on like marketing and advertising, because what these people are doing when we talk about like Elmo Roper's, they set up things like there's one called the Psychological Corporation, right? It's a company that started in 1921, and they're the ones who start doing for the first time these continuous polls about what they call a brand barometer, right? And this is connected to this is connected to Women's Home Companion like magazine, which is like something that like General Foods has a big interest in, and like that's where it all comes from. Is like they're able to have a survey that they do of like a 1,500 housewives, right? They're telling them, this is focus grouping what perceptions of different corporate brands are, right? This is where that comes from. This is literally the beginning of that. So it's in this context of, something like John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s, missionary work that this is coming about.
Yeah, and I guess in a way, like what ends up happening is it just kind of gets translated into the theater of economic warfare.